Snowflakes whipped against Caleb Turner's face as he trudged through the park, his battered toolbox weighing down one shoulder. The wind cut through his thin jacket like a knife, but he pushed forward, thinking only of getting home to his little girl and the single sandwich tucked inside his worn satchel. It wasn't much, just white bread with a thin layer of meat and cheese, but it was all they had for dinner. He planned to split it with her, as they had done many times before. Then he heard it, not the howl of the wind or the crunch of snow under his boots, but a sound that didn't belong to the storm, soft, shaky sobs drifting through the icy air. Caleb slowed, scanning the white blur around him. Near a lonely bench half buried in snow, 3 small figures huddled together. Snow had gathered on their hair and shoulders as if they had been sitting there far too long. He approached quickly, his voice steady but gentle. "Hey, what are you doing out here alone? You'll freeze." The oldest, a boy of about 6, lifted his head. His cheeks were flushed from the cold, his nose red, his voice trembling. I can't find my mom." Beside him, a little girl clutched a younger boy against her chest. Her lips were pale, her eyes wide. "We're hungry," she whispered, almost afraid to say it. Caleb's gaze swept the empty park. No adults in sight, no movement except for the drifting snow. Dropping into a crouch, he asked softly, "How long have you been here?" The boy just shook his head, eyes glassy. Caleb's hand went to the inside of his coat, fingers brushing against the sandwich wrapped in brown paper. His stomach clenched at the thought of Emma, his daughter, waiting at home. But the sight before him, 3 children in thin coats, wet mittens and trembling bodies, made the choice for him. Slowly he unwrapped the sandwich, tore it into 4 uneven pieces, and kept the smallest for himself. "Here," he said, holding out the food. "It's not much, but it'll help." The boy hesitated, then took a bite, chewing slowly as snow melted into rivulets down his cheeks. "You're my hero," he murmured so softly Caleb almost didn't hear it. When the youngest started coughing, a harsh, rattling sound, Caleb pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around the child without hesitation, the wind biting at his own arms. "Let's get you somewhere warm," he said firmly, reaching out a hand. One by one they took it. Lifting the smallest into his arms, Caleb started toward the dim glow of his weathered little house, each step crunching through the snow. Behind them, the storm raged on, but he didn't look back. Inside Caleb's small house, the blast of icy wind was replaced by the still dry air of a place that, though modest, was kept with care. The floorboards creaked under their boots, and mismatched furniture sat in a neat but worn arrangement. Framed photographs lined the wall above the sagging couch, snapshots of Emma through the years, smiling in ways that could light up a room. From the hallway she appeared now, rubbing her sleepy eyes, her chestnut hair a tousled halo. "Daddy, you're home," she murmured, but her gaze shifted quickly to the 3 children trailing behind him, their cheeks red from cold. "These are some friends who needed to warm up," Caleb explained gently, setting little Eli on his feet. Emma tilted her head curiously, her shyness giving way to a small smile. "Hi," she said, her voice warm. Sophie clutched her little brother's hand tighter, but Noah's eyes darted around, scanning the unfamiliar space as if unsure whether to relax. Caleb set his toolbox by the door and knelt to unlace their soaked boots, placing them near the old radiator that rattled softly but still gave off heat. "Let's get these off so your toes can thaw out," he said, his voice calm, practical. Sensing their uncertainty, Emma darted to her room and returned with a plastic bin. "Do you like Lego?" she asked brightly. Before long, the 4 of them were kneeling on the carpet, colorful bricks scattered in front of them, their cautious postures softening as they began to build. From the kitchen, the scent of cocoa soon drifted through the air. Caleb had heated water in a dented kettle and poured it into a single large mug, stirring in cocoa powder until it turned a rich brown. There was only enough for one, but he placed it carefully in the center of their little circle. "Share this," he said softly. "Small sips. It's hot." Emma was the first to take a sip, but knowing there wouldn't be more, she passed it quickly to Sophie without a word. As the children played, Caleb noticed Sophie clutching a worn stuffed bear, its ear torn and stuffing peeking out. Without a word, he reached for an old sewing kit from the shelf and sat beside her. His big work-rough hands moved with surprising care as he stitched the tear closed. Sophie's wide eyes followed every motion. When he handed the bear back, repaired and smoothed, she gave a faint but genuine smile, the first since he'd found them. Across town, in the bright, chaotic warmth of a police station, Victoria Hale was pacing, her elegant camel coat doing little to hide her tension. Her usually composed voice trembled as she repeated the description of her children, triplets, 6 years old, missing since they'd been separated from her in a crowded mall. Officers typed quickly, radios crackled, and Victoria's eyes kept flicking toward the door as if willing her children to walk in. She didn't know that at that very moment, Noah, Sophie, and Eli were sitting cross-legged on the worn carpet of a stranger's living room, their fingers fitting Lego bricks together while Emma laughed at something Eli said. She didn't know that her daughter's patched bear was cradled safely in her arms, or that the man who had found them had given away his only jacket to keep Eli warm. When Caleb quietly called the police to report finding 3 lost children, the dispatcher's voice grew brisk. "We got a report matching them exactly. Stay put. Officers are on the way." Moments later, headlights swept across the living room as tires crunched over snow outside. The knock on the door was sharp, urgent. Caleb opened it to find 2 officers flanking a woman whose eyes immediately searched past him. Victoria's breath caught when she saw them. "Noah, Sophie, Eli," she cried, rushing in to drop to her knees and wrap them in her arms. Sobs and laughter tangled together as the triplets clung to her. Caleb stepped back, hands in his pockets, not to distance himself, but to give them space. One of the officers leaned toward Victoria, murmuring an offer to check him out, but after a long, assessing look around the small home and at her children's scarves and mittens, clearly not their own, she shook her head. "No," she said simply. "He took care of them." Caleb only shrugged, murmuring, "Just doing what anyone would do." But Victoria knew deep down that wasn't true. In the days that followed, Victoria couldn't quite shake the image of her children sitting safely in Caleb Turner's small but warm home, their cheeks flushed, not from cold but from play. Yet, alongside her gratitude, a subtle wariness lingered, one she had carried ever since her marriage ended, and trust had become something she gave sparingly. Caleb was nothing like the people in her world. He was a roofer who wore work boots scuffed from years on the job, a man whose jacket was patched in more than one place, and yet he had been the one to shelter her children when she wasn't there. A few days later, fate crossed their paths again. Victoria's SUV sputtered to a stop on a snowy roadside as the late afternoon light faded. She was reaching for her phone when the low rumble of an old blue pickup truck pulled in behind her. The driver's window rolled down, and there was Caleb, his face flushed from the cold, concern etched into his features. "Need a hand?" he called over the wind. Despite her hesitation, she let him look under the hood. His movements were confident and unhurried, his large hands working with quiet precision. When he asked her to pass him a wrench, their fingers brushed, and he noticed instantly how cold hers were. Without a second thought, he pulled off one of his mismatched gloves and handed it to her. "You keep this one," he said, turning back to the engine before she could protest. Within minutes, the SUV coughed back to life. When she tried to offer payment, he shook his head firmly. "No need." She drove away with a quiet "thank you," the warmth of his glove lingering longer than she expected. But warmth has a way of cooling under the shadow of suspicion. At a gas station not long after, Victoria overheard 2 women whispering, mentioning Caleb by name, speculating that he might be getting close to her for her money, making remarks about people from his part of town. She didn't engage, but the words stung, feeding the caution she was already fighting. She told herself she was only being careful for her children's sake. Still, Noah, Sophie, and Eli were relentless in their request to see Emma again. "Please, Mom," Noah begged one Saturday morning. "Emma said she built a Lego city and needs help finishing it." Sophie clasped her hands dramatically, adding, "And she promised we could have cocoa." Even quiet Eli managed a small, "Please?" Victoria sighed, feigning reluctance, but deep down she already knew she would give in. That afternoon she parked outside Caleb's house. Snow had softened the rough edges of the neighborhood, making it look almost picturesque. Emma flung the door open, her smile wide, and the triplets darted inside, laughter trailing in their wake. Caleb appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Hey," he greeted, his tone polite, his eyes meeting hers only briefly before turning to the children. "I'll pick them up in an hour," Victoria said coolly. When she returned earlier than expected, the Lego city sprawled half-finished across the living room floor. The children's laughter quieted at her arrival. Caleb helped the triplets into their coats without comment, but his steady gaze lingered on hers for just a moment, calm, unreadable, and carrying something muted she couldn't quite name. As they stepped outside, Emma tugged at her father's sleeve. "Daddy, can I take this to Mrs. Peterson?" she asked, holding up a brown paper bag. Caleb nodded distractedly, and Emma ran off. What he didn't know was that Victoria had leaned down before they left, whispering to Emma to tell him it was from a neighbor. Inside the bag was bread and stew she had made that morning. She couldn't quite bring herself to hand it to him directly. Part pride, part the stubborn walls she still kept between them. What neither of them realized was that the snow that had softened the streets that day would soon turn to ice, and that the next time their paths crossed, it wouldn't be over Lego or Coco, but over a moment that would force both of them to see each other in a different light. 2 nights later, winter bared its teeth. Freezing rain turned to sheets of ice that glittered under the dim street lamps, and the wind clawed at every corner of the small town. Victoria gripped the steering wheel of her SUV, her children's laughter filling the car as she drove toward Caleb's house for their planned visit with Emma. The tires hummed over the slick surface, but as she rounded a bend, the hum shifted to a sickening slide. The steering wheel jerked in her hands, the back end of the SUV fishtailing toward the ditch that dropped steeply just beyond the edge of the road. "Noah, Sophie, Eli, hold on!" she shouted, her heart slamming against her ribs. The children's voices turned from laughter to screams. The car skidded sideways, the metal undercarriage grinding against ice, and came to a jarring stop with the front wheels hanging inches from the drop. Before Victoria could catch her breath, the front door of Caleb's house slammed open. He was already running toward them, boots slipping on the treacherous surface. Without hesitation, he wrenched open the back door, pulling Noah out first, then Sophie, then Eli, cradling each one tightly before setting them on the snowy shoulder. "Inside," he ordered Emma, who had darted out in slippers. She obeyed without a word, rushing to hold the front door open against the wind. Finally, he turned to Victoria. "Come on," he said, extending a hand. She hesitated only a moment before taking it, her own hand cold and trembling in his. His grip was firm, anchoring her as he pulled her out and steadied her on the ice. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind whipped strands of her hair across her face, and snowflakes clung to his hair, the stark heat of his gaze cutting through the bitter cold. He crouched and wrapped his arms around all 3 children at once, pulling them close in a protective embrace. They clung to him without hesitation, their small hands clutching at his coat, their faces buried against his shoulders as though instinctively certain he would not let go. Victoria stood a few feet away, her pulse slowing as she watched. Something in her chest loosened, just a fraction, but enough for her to feel the shift. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice nearly carried off by the wind. He met her eyes, his tone even but understated, just doing what anyone would do. Later that night, as she drove home slowly, her hands tight on the wheel, Victoria knew his words weren't quite true. Not everyone would run headlong into ice and wind to pull strangers to safety, and not everyone would risk their own footing to make sure each child was safely inside before turning back for her. Across town, in his small, dimly lit kitchen, Caleb sat rubbing the lingering chill from his fingers. He thought of the brief moment when she'd looked at him without the usual guarded distance in her eyes, and how quickly that look had vanished. "2 different worlds," he murmured to himself, the phrase settling heavily in his chest. He wasn't wrong. Her life and his couldn't have been more different. And yet, for those few minutes on the ice, none of that had mattered. Neither of them knew that the true test of trust and courage was yet to come, and it would arrive in the form of a blizzard fiercer than anything the town had seen in years. A storm that would trap them together and strip away every excuse to keep their distance. The storm came faster than anyone expected. By mid-afternoon, the sky had turned a bruised gray, and the wind roared through the narrow streets like a living thing. Snow drove sideways, piling against houses and burying cars to their windows. Inside Caleb's small home, the radiator groaned in protest before giving out entirely, leaving only the flickering glow of a few emergency candles to hold back the dark. The children were already huddled together, Emma curled on the couch under a thick blanket, Noah beside her with flushed cheeks, Sophie leaning weakly against her brother, and Eli on the floor wrapped in another quilt. Victoria knelt by them, brushing her hand over Noah's forehead, then Sophie's. "They're burning up," she said, her voice tight with worry. Caleb opened the small basket in the cabinet, finding only a half bottle of children's aspirin, enough for maybe 2 doses, far too little to last the night. "The roads are closed," Victoria said quickly when he reached for his coat. "No one's going anywhere in this weather." Caleb's eyes met hers, steady and unyielding. "I've already lost someone I love," he said over the howl of the wind. "I'm not letting any of these kids be in danger." She started to protest, but he was already pulling on his thick flannel shirt, layering an old sweater over it before shrugging into his winter coat, torn at the cuff, but still warm enough to face the storm. A faded scarf went around his neck, boots laced tight, knit cap pulled low over his ears. "You can't," she tried again, but he cut her off with a simple, "I have to." The door slammed shut behind him and the wind hit like a wall. Snow stung his face, blinding him as he leaned into the gale. His boots crunched over ice, each step deliberate as he made his way toward the main road. The cold bit through every layer, his gloves stiff with ice, his breath burning in his chest. Halfway there, the roar of a snowmobile cut through the storm, swerving to avoid him at the last second. The gust of air knocked him off balance, sending him to the ground hard enough to jar his teeth. For a moment he lay there, the snow swallowing him, but the memory of Emma's flushed cheeks and the triplets' fever-bright eyes pushed him to his feet. By the time he reached the pharmacy, the lights were off, a closed sign swaying in the wind. He pounded on the glass until a man appeared inside, shaking his head. Caleb's voice cracked as he called out, "4 sick kids at home, high fevers, not enough medicine for the night." Something in his tone must have broken through because after a pause, the man unlocked the door. Minutes later, Caleb emerged with fever reducer, electrolyte drinks, and heat packs stuffed into his coat pockets. Back at the house, Victoria sat on the couch with Emma's head in her lap, the triplets gathered close on either side. The candlelight cast a soft glow across her face, but her eyes were fixed on the door, imagining the bitter wind and the unlit streets. Guilt gnawed at her. Guilt for doubting him, for letting the whispers of others cloud what she'd seen with her own eyes. When the door finally burst open, a swirl of snow came with it, followed by Caleb, his coat crusted with ice, his breath ragged. He set the supplies on the table before she could even speak. And then, without thinking, she was on her knees in front of him, her arms wrapping around his cold, stiff frame, tears mixed with the melting snow on his shoulders. "I was wrong about you," she whispered, her voice breaking. His arms hesitated, then came around her, holding her just firmly enough. "Doesn't matter," he murmured. "They're safe now." Later, after the children had taken their medicine and were tucked under blankets, Victoria sat at the table, gently wrapping a bandage around Caleb's scraped hands. Her fingers fumbled with the gauze, and he gave a soft laugh. "You're wrapping it backward." She glanced up, startled, then smiled faintly. "Oh, am I? CEO of a big company and can't even bandage a hand," he teased, his tone warm enough to make her cheeks flush. From the couch, the children giggled at the exchange, and for the first time since the storm began, the air in the room felt lighter. Outside, the blizzard still howled, but inside, something fragile and important had shifted. Walls that had seemed immovable just hours ago had begun to crumble. When the blizzard finally loosened its grip on the town, the world outside Caleb's front door was buried beneath drifts as high as fences. Streets were still lined with icy ridges, but life slowly began to stir again. Victoria and the children started coming by often, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just to sit by the fire while Emma and the triplets turned the living room into a fortress of blankets and Lego towers. The easy laughter of the children filled the small house in a way that made the winter feel less sharp. Victoria no longer stood stiffly at the doorway as she once had. She would take off her coat, roll up her sleeves, and join the warmth inside. Even the neighbors, who had once whispered over coffee about the unlikely connection between the wealthy CEO and the local roofer, began to soften. They'd seen Caleb pull Victoria and the children out of that icy near accident weeks earlier, and more than one admitted, quietly, that maybe they'd misjudged him. Still, not all doubts were gone. One evening after Victoria and the triplets had left, Caleb sat at the kitchen table, oiling a wrench while Emma colored at the counter. His eyes followed the neat, careful strokes of her crayon before he finally spoke. "Emma," he said, his voice low, "I'm not sure I belong in their world." She set down her crayon and looked at him. "What do you mean?" "They've got a different life, a bigger life. People might think—" He hesitated, rubbing the edge of the wrench with his thumb. "They might think I'm after something that's not mine." Emma tilted her head, studying him with a seriousness that only a child could pull off. "But you're not," she said simply. "You're just you, and she knows that." The next day, the children seemed to have taken her words to heart. Lucas, now Noah in Caleb's mind, but always the ringleader to Emma, pulled his sisters and Emma into a huddle on the front porch, whispering like conspirators. "We just have to get them alone," Noah said, "so they'll talk." "Or maybe kiss," Sophie giggled, earning an eye roll from Emma. "Leave that to them," Emma replied with a grin. That afternoon, the four of them found Caleb in the garage tinkering with an old carburetor. "Can we see how you fix things?" Eli asked innocently. Caleb glanced up and smiled. "Sure, but—" Before he could finish, they darted inside, pulling Victoria in with them. The garage door swung shut, the latch clicking firmly into place. Victoria looked around, momentarily startled by the sudden quiet. "Did they just lock us in?" Caleb set down his tools, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Looks that way." For a moment, the only sound was the tick of the space heater. Caleb's voice broke the silence, low and steady. "Victoria, I don't want anyone thinking you chose the wrong person." She turned toward him fully, her gaze unwavering. "Caleb, I don't need someone who matches me dollar for dollar. I need someone who matches me heart for heart." He searched her expression as if weighing whether to believe her. She stepped closer, her tone softening. "You've done something for me no one else could. You've shown me what it feels like not to be alone. And it has nothing to do with money or status. It's because you care and because you're brave enough to act when it matters." The weight of her words seemed to loosen something inside him, a knot he'd carried for far too long. He took a slow step toward her. Outside the garage door, 4 small faces were pressed against the narrow window. "Are they going to kiss yet?" Noah whispered to Emma. She elbowed him, grinning. "Shh, let them be." Caleb caught sight of the little spies and shook his head with a laugh. "You little troublemakers." The children scattered with squeals of laughter, their boots thudding across the porch. Victoria laughed too, the sound light and unguarded. When she looked back at him, there was no hesitation in her eyes. For the first time, Caleb let himself believe she meant every word. Spring came slowly that year, melting away the last icy traces of winter like a memory you no longer needed to hold on to. On a quiet corner lot where an abandoned gas station once stood, a simple sign now hung above freshly painted garage doors: Turner's Auto Repair. The paint was chipped at one edge, but to Caleb Turner it was perfect. Proof of a dream built not on money, but on hard work and second chances. Inside, the smell of motor oil mixed with fresh coffee. Tools hung neatly on the walls, each one with a story. Emma was in the corner, helping Sophie and Lily, now inseparable, organize a box of wrenches, while Noah and Eli competed to see who could make the hood of an old Chevy shine the brightest. Laughter bounced off the garage walls, mingling with the low hum of an old radio. Victoria Hale stood by the open bay door, sunlight catching in her hair. Gone were the heels and tailored suits. She wore a simple blouse, her hands tucked into the pockets of well-worn jeans. She glanced at Caleb, her expression warm and steady. There was no longer her side of town or his, just one family, forged through storms both literal and unseen. A week later, the community gathered at the town hall for the launch of the Single Father Support Fund. Standing at the podium, Victoria's voice carried over the crowd. "This foundation was inspired by a man who taught me that wealth isn't measured in accounts or titles. True wealth lies in kindness, courage, and the willingness to give when you have little to spare." Her eyes found Caleb's in the audience. "Caleb Turner showed me that." Later in the park, Caleb stood by a picnic bench, slicing a thick sandwich into generous pieces and passing them to anyone whose hands were empty. Noah took a piece and grinned. This time you didn't have to share, but you still did. Caleb smiled, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. Some habits are worth keeping. As the sun dipped low, Victoria spread a blanket under the budding maples. Children ran barefoot across the grass, their laughter rising like music into the golden evening. She leaned her head against Caleb's shoulder, his fingers entwining with hers. He looked over the scene, Emma and the triplets, now siblings in all but blood, and felt the quiet certainty of her words in the garage echo inside him. We're a family now. Life lesson. True wealth isn't about what you own, it's about what you give. Caleb had little in his pockets when he shared his last sandwich that snowy night, but his heart was full enough to change lives. Kindness doesn't wait for perfect circumstances. It steps forward in the storm, even when the wind cuts deep. In the end, the smallest acts, a shared meal, a repaired toy, a steady hand in the cold, can build bridges between worlds that seem impossibly far apart. If Caleb and Victoria's journey touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced or witnessed an act of kindness that changed your life? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Soul Stirring Stories for more real-life tales of courage, compassion, and love. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that might just change the way you see the world. And until next time, keep your heart open and your kindness flowing.